So now if we're looking at the way that these stories are told, and we'll now focus on Christianity at this point, and the biblical renditions of Jesus dying on the cross, crucifixion, virgin birth, etc. You mentioned that there was no mention of any crucifixion until roughly 6 centuries after the event, or the reported event. So how does this become taken as fact?
Well, the crucifixion is in the texts of the 2nd century, which is, I claim, the biblical texts are from the 2nd century. However, it was not depicted. He was not depicted on a cross. That was not a central icon to the story. In fact, the early apologists are apologetic about why God could be killed in the first place, and they try to avoid this imagery and saying that we do not worship a criminal and his cross. You, on the other hand, have crosses on your standards with men on them and so forth. But that iconography was not until the 6th century, so we have other gods depicted on crosses prior to that. At some point, as in the rest, as they're amalgamating, they'll find probably a pocket of people who are fervid cross worshippers, and maybe they're Dionysus followers, and so then a priest will sit down and look, our God was on a cross too, and here's an image, take this one instead. And this is how it came to be usurped.
So what about the actual entity that is known as Jesus? If you look into the work, say, of Lawrence Gardner, Bloodline of the Holy Grail, says, yes, the entity existed, this person did exist, but it wasn't exactly the way the story is rendered in the Bible, but rather these were more titles. Even the name Joseph, for example, more of a title. The Messiahs, there were many. It was more of a title or a job description. How do you fit in essence, the dismissal of the individuals in with that?
Well, the word Christos, is in the Old Testament. It's used dozens of times in reference to a number of people, including Cyrus, the Babylonian king who was in charge, or the Persian who was in charge of Babylon during the so-called exile. The Jews then believed that he was the Christos, he was the Messiah, Savior and Messiah. And the name Jesus also was used about 300 times in reference to any person named Joshua there, when the scriptures were translated into the Greek. So we have a Jesus the Christ in Joshua, the old patriarch. Prior to the Christian era, there were Joshua worshippers. They set up temples to him who believed that he had brought the Jews into the promised land and that he would come back again and do it again. So they were waiting for Joshua, Jesus, the Messiah, Christ, to come back again. And so immediately you're in suspicious territory because, wow, all of a sudden he shows up, and yet none of the historians see him. So there were certainly people. I'm not saying Joshua was a real person either. Joshua was also a sun god, but one of the gods that was usurped by the Yahweh cults in order to make a bigger unified territory were the Joshua followers. So, but you already had, prior to the Christian era, these people worshiping Jesus, both in Judaism and in paganism, with the epithet IES or Jason. Asclepius was named IES, Dionysus was named IES, which is basically Jesus, the name Jesus. So there doesn't become any reason for a real person. The earliest Gnostic texts with their Docetism, which says that the God of the cosmos cannot become human or cannot take form in matter. You had that going on. There's really no reason to look for a person other than somebody started saying, hey, yeah, that was a real person and he lived here and there and there. In other words, the Jews who were writing it, or the Israelites, were likely, well, the ones who were writing it were certainly aware that this was allegory that they were placing in a different era, because they made a tremendous amount of mistakes when they were putting it into that era. They did not know the history of the time. You can tell it's distanced from then, from when it supposedly happened, which is the 1st century. You can see that it was written by somebody who didn't live there. People will be able to find anything they want in there. You have that whole Holy Blood, Holy Grail thing going on, but yet prior to the advent of Christianity in the British Isles, there already was a Holy Grail cup. It was quite common, and it had to do with the uterus and the menstrual cycle, the menses, in goddess worshipping cultures, or just both, having both genders. So there isn't really anything original there either to trace some guy to.
I suppose what I'm wondering, is it possible that it's almost as though we're talking about a God overlay to perhaps people who were very real of the time? It's just that they're being attributed with godlike status because maybe they were socially far up the scale, or in terms of their education, or maybe even having belonged to mystical societies and were part of the hierarchy of those that were, in essence, creating the needs for religion of that time. So is it possible some of these people actually did exist, but just not as, quote, known as now the Son of God?
No, not the major characters, not the big guys like Krishna, Christ, Buddha, Osiris, Hercules, Thor, Zeus. No, those are myths. This battle has taken on at least 3 perspectives. One is people who believe that they're wholly true and they happened in real life and everything is true about them, including the divinity of the god, and so forth. The second one is people who have thought, well, there was somebody there who existed, and then they attached a bunch of fairy tales and myths to their story. And then the third perspective is that they are mythical entities from the beginning. And to account for them, we have to say that the people who created the story took myths and put them into history, forced them into history. There are examples of both of the 2 last ones. I couldn't claim examples for the first one. That would make me a believer of some religion. But the second one, sure. Things like Alexander the Great had superhuman attributes at times put on his story, and many rulers had. But see, this is where you get into really investigating it very in depth to figure out, okay, is this, well, that's called evamerism, is where you take a person and attribute all kinds of fairy tales and myths to his or her mundane biography. That's where you have to get in there with a microscope and figure out, is there any core to this onion once you start peeling away the mythical accretions? The Jesus Seminar people throwing out all of the myths and many of the sayings that they had discovered to have been found in other cultures and not original to Jesus. They came up with the cynic sage who wandered about and said a few things. But then you can go even further and say, well, but those sayings are not original either, and you can trace those sayings somewhere else in the prior to the Christian era. So you really end up with an amalgam of, there's no ways about it, it's an amalgam of, let's say, 20 characters. And Gerald Massey once said, a composite of 20 people is no one. So even if you could find someone to point to, that starts to fall away. Now, as concerns somebody like Paul, who probably, of all the Christians in the New Testament, Paul probably has the most historicity. However, he does not appear in history anywhere, even though he claims he caused all this trouble among the Jews, and Josephus was nearby and doesn't record any of these military movements where he went in and killed a bunch of people, and that's nowhere to be found in history. And you'd think that, I mean, Jewish people are pretty upset if you go in and kill them en masse. They would record it somewhere, but they don't talk about Paul at all. And then you find out that, well, isn't it strange that Paul's journeys take him to brotherhood strongholds? This brotherhood, you could call it Masonic, you can call it tends to be Masonic because they would build with stone, and stone lasts the longest. But they're also, like I said, carpenter gods and smith gods. There's a brotherhood that's traceable. The Essenes are a branch of it. They're not the whole thing. There's a brotherhood that's traceable from Britain to India, and they are not completely closely knit. They're in competition, but they do have connections, so they can give each other signals and get into each other's inner sanctums, and then learn their secrets. These sites that Paul is addressing in the New Testament epistles, Ephesus, Galatia, Corinth, and so on, these all had very powerful brotherhood seats there. And oddly enough, before him, this person named Apollonius of Tyana went to the same places. He included Samothrace on his itinerary, which is also a huge seat of the mysteries, the Samothracian mysteries. And he goes in the opposite direction, so it's almost as if they took Apollonius of Tyana's travels, did it in the opposite direction, and attached Paul's name to it. So I think part of the basis of Paul, for example, is Apollonius of Tyana. Some claim that he called himself Paul, P-O-L, Apollonius Paul. And then, interestingly enough, 5 centuries before that, Orpheus went to the exact same places, proselytizing the great god Dionysus, who was our Savior, Lord and Savior, who died and was resurrected, and who went by the moniker IES. So
are you saying that these geographical locations or edifices that these characters throughout history migrated to were all, in essence, the mystery school strongholds? And are you saying that these same individuals would be the puppeteers that create the needs for the legends, religions, etc.?
yeah, or they had the hierarchy in the mystery schools make up, for example, in the case of Orpheus. Orpheus became this very powerful figure who does not appear in history, but is like a code word for an initiate. You know, the Mormons go out for 2 years and they go on their missions. Well, an initiate would have to go play Orpheus, say. It's your time to go be Orpheus, and it seems also that they had these basic letters where they would address the group that they went to, the particular brotherhood they went to, and that these letters became accreted, interpolated, and eventually they became the Pauline epistles. When they get into specific, you can read some of there's mystery school language in the epistles like crazy, and particularly Masonic. I have some writings on that where I go into a lot of the Masonic symbols especially in
Oh,
those
good. I want to show you one later
epistles.
and ask you what it is. I think it's one of their primary ones I'm curious about. Yes. So you're saying if I'm understanding you, that the lineage of these mystery schools or these orders dates how far back then? Where do they start appearing, where all these others start, in essence, migrating to these places throughout the historical texts?
No, that's a good question. We have a discussion, a legend, in the 8th century of Numa Pompilius, I think you pronounce it, who was the king of Italy at the time. And the legend has the establishment of collegia attributed to him, colleges, that were essentially what we think of as Masonic lodges. But they had every craft involved in them. Anything that was necessary, forging weapons, very important, making wheels, carpentry, of course, smithcraft. Masonry was the choice for gods and pharaohs and kings who wanted to last forever. So these were set up to foster the actual crafts and arts, but they also had a whole initiation structure with levels, and you start off as a peon and have a certain experience, and it was pretty de rigueur. And it's kind of the way it is today. If you want to really get somewhere in a particular business, you have to join the Elks or the Masons.
So this was in essence a political
But it was also
entity
religious.
of sorts, and religious, but it had political overtones in terms of what the thinking of the day was going to become, etc., who would
Yes.
be followed and worshipped. And
Mithra, for example, became very popular within burial organizations. I suppose that's because his thing is rock-borne caves. There's a lot of underground motifs. There's a Eucharist and Last Supper. In other words, there's some sort of rites and rituals that help the dead move along. So burial associations, it was a burial guild. And then that could be traced back, though, to very primitive times where you find relics in caves that are clearly placed there in a ritual ceremony in order to facilitate the spirit's passing. And from there, you could really probably find artifacts around the world that would just start accumulating the evidence of what I'm talking about to the point where it became such a complex and effective ideology to gather so many different cultures and people together. Although they did fight like crazy. To keep, in Europe, for example, the Lithuanians were the last stronghold of paganism. They fought Christianity off until the 14th century. And in other words, people didn't just rolled over and say, hey, that's a great idea. I think I'll give up the worship of my ancestors and convert tomorrow. You say I get what? There was nothing new that they would be getting in return anyway. And some of them were quite indignant. The Nordics, for example, who are fairly fiery people, said, you're telling me that my ancestors are all in hell because they worshipped my gods? But, by God, you're wrong, and get out of here before I chop your head off, is what their response was.
Well, isn't that sort of the response people are having to you today as the one delivering this information?
Yeah, although I'm not trying to convert them to my God. But yeah, I do have that response. I also have responses that mitigate that very nicely. People tell me, oh, thank you so much for freeing me from this, helping me free myself from this erroneous ideology that has caused me nothing but grief from childhood. I had an elderly couple tell me that they could die in peace now, and they were pretty close to it when they wrote to me, so I haven't heard from them, but they had read my book 3 times each.
Which book are you speaking of?
The first book, The Christ Conspiracy, the greatest story ever sold. They'd read that 3 times each, and they said it had removed the fear and guilt and shame of being alive, and they could pass now without being terrified that something on the other side was going to get them. Or
is that part of what you're trying to do with this, other than purely exposing it from an academic viewpoint?
I did have a philanthropic motivation to begin with. That one was a pleasant surprise. I maybe had considered that, except that other people had told me, hey, you don't want to do this to older people. Give them a heart attack and they'll die. And it turns out, well, actually, no, maybe they'll live longer because they're not consumed with this torment. But yeah, one of the things when I started uncovering this stuff, I thought to myself, first of all, okay, why you? And then it dawned on me, well, all right, I'm an archaeologist. I can make my way through a variety of languages, which is what it takes, really. You have to be able to learn things on the spot, linguistically.
Speaking of linguistics, how many languages do you speak, or can you at least decipher?
Yeah, I can mostly read. I'm a little rusty on most of them speaking, although modern Greek I'm pretty good at. Greek, modern and ancient, and then Latin I can read a little bit. French I read very well. Spanish, Italian I can read. German I can do okay. I tend to have a dictionary, especially German.
So in other words, you can find your way around a variety of ancient documents with just relative ease.
Yeah, Sanskrit, Hebrew. If I have my source tools with me, I can make my way through those. Yeah, I mean, if I need to. On the spot, I've had to learn several words in Sanskrit. I'd say quite a few words in Sanskrit, and to recognize them. And Hebrew as well, I've had to. Those are not easy languages, really, particularly.
So this is why you, in part.
Yeah, because I had that capacity already, and archaeologists do tend to have the ability to be able to read languages. They have to do that. But the other thing was, too, that I had growing up a very strong empathy for all life, and I used to become very sickened by the divisiveness, and particularly of religion. I could see it as a child. I said, "Yeah, what are these people believing in this stuff? It just makes them all angry and want to hurt each other," and they certainly do. It prevents people from getting to know how nice another person really could be. If you and I were sitting here and you had your mumbo jumbo stuff on that was clearly saying to me, "My belief is superior to yours," you've immediately shot down any chance that we could have a real civil conversation, because I'm getting an air of arrogance and superiority from you, and,
Right.
and you're obviously not open to hearing anything I have to say. So you could find out that, hey, I'm actually a pretty nice person, and we get along and have some fun. But fun does not seem to be the push behind religion. It's not fun. It's to be made a robot to recite rote, and everybody seems to be about suffering and so forth. So when I encounter other people who have this self-willed self-motivation to get their passion and vision out there, I think to myself, and I'll ask them, "Why are you doing it?" Because you're like really nasty. This happened to me repeatedly. You're very nasty, and I don't think they're replacing the nasty system you're criticizing with your nasty system is an improvement. If we're trying to ameliorate a problem, can we not focus on making a better life, a better world, a happier place? I had someone criticize me for using my for using a pseudonym, and he said, I said, "Well, I don't want people to associate my other name with that, and to me it's fun. What I'm doing is fun." He said, "Well, isn't it lying? It's not your." I said, "No, it's not lying. It's fun. I'm having fun with the world. I'm trying to. This information is serious, and it's truthful, and it's factual. But if people aren't having fun with it or feeling better about themselves, then that's not, that's my purpose really, is to have people think to themselves, oh, I don't have to hate my neighbor. I don't have to think of my family and friends as being sinners who are going to hell."
So it's really about creating a freedom of spirit.
Freedom, exactly. Somebody said I had something to do with hardcore atheists, and someone else wrote that they had become an atheist since reading my works, and I said, well, that's not my goal. You can be an atheist or you can not be an atheist. I firmly believe that the human mind has the capacity to be theist, atheist, polytheistic, monotheistic, henotheistic, deist, all at once. That we should have that freedom of thinking, of thought, freedom of spirit and thought. Mm-hmm. That we are our own beings, our autonomous beings who, if somebody doesn't muck up our lives, can actually live pretty nicely.
Well, and none of us can live without the sun. It comes right back to it. The one thing I suppose that really is the deciding factor on regarding life here is the sun, and appropriately so. The name of your most recent book is The Sons of God, S-U-N-S, Sons of God. Thank
Krishna, Buddha, and Christ Unveiled.
Yes, this is fascinating work, and I would like to have, just in case the viewer detected a teensy-weensy bit of snoring, if you just want to tilt the camera down a little bit. And this is little Jason. Is there some symbolism? Yeah, Jason returned. Is there some symbolism behind that one?
Jason and the Argonauts.
There
Yeah, sure. Jason was a solar myth.
Well, right now Jason has his little teddy bear and he's curled up in your lap, and I'll be curious to see 20 years from now what's up with Jason.